There are certain names that history remembers etched into books, repeated in documentaries, passed down through headlines and timelines. But there are others that vanish, almost as though someone meant for them to disappear. Mary Mohrman was just a child, only 8 years old. And yet, more than a century after her murder, her name barely lingers in the conversation around America's most chilling unsolved mysteries. This wasn't a case of a child lost in the woods or swept away by tragedy. Mary lived in St. Louis, Missouri, a bustling city already humming with life in the early 1900s. Her neighborhood was modest but respectable, tucked into a quiet corner of the city where neighbors knew one another and children played freely in the streets. It was a time when innocence felt like a given, not a privilege. And Mary, sweet, soft-spoken, and known for her gentle nature, was part of that fabric of trust that held communities like hers together. But on May 4th, 1909, that trust was shattered. Mary left her home to deliver a small package to a neighbor, a routine errand, a kind she'd done many times before. She said goodbye to her family, stepped out the door, and never came back. Hours passed, then panic, then a search that stretched across neighborhoods, alleyways, and eventually newspapers. And when Mary's lifeless body was finally found in a deserted yard, brutally assaulted and left behind as though her life had meant nothing, the city recoiled in horror. You might think a case this devastating would become a cornerstone of true crime history, that her name would live alongside other tragic victims whose stories we revisit in podcasts and documentaries. But the Mary Mohrman case was quickly buried by time, by discomfort, and perhaps by deliberate silence. It was labeled solved far too quickly. And for those who looked closely, that conclusion felt too neat, too clean for the facts on the ground. The investigation was marred by public pressure, shaky evidence, and a suspect who may have been more scapegoat than killer. There were questions, so many questions. Why were certain leads ignored? Why did the story vanish from major newspapers just weeks after dominating headlines? And perhaps most haunting of all, could the real killer have walked free, blending back into the very streets that Mary once walked? More than a century has passed since Mary's voice was silenced. Her family is long gone. The buildings have changed. The streets have been renamed. But the horror of what happened still echoes for those who care to listen. It's the kind of story that doesn't scream. It haunts. Quietly, softly, like a whisper carried on a Missouri wind. And that's what we're here to do, to listen. To retrace Mary's steps. To revisit the world she lived in and the terrifying events of that day. And maybe, by bringing her story back into the light, we can ask the questions no one was willing to ask back then. This is the horrifying and heartbreaking story of Mary Mohrman, a crime that time tried to forget, but one we must remember. Before she became the center of a horrifying true crime mystery, Mary Mohrman was simply a child, a daughter, a sister, a neighbor. She wasn't known across the country. Her name wasn't in textbooks or trial records that echoed through the decades. But within the few city blocks of St. Louis, Missouri, that she called home, Mary was well loved and warmly remembered. She was just 8 years old in the spring of 1909, not yet old enough to understand the dangers that sometimes lurked beneath the surface of her city, but old enough to know how to navigate her daily routines with a quiet kind of confidence. Mary was the kind of girl who brought calm to a room, gentle and well-mannered, with a reserved, observant way of interacting with the world. She didn't demand attention. She didn't need to. Her kindness was her presence. Mary lived with her family in a modest brick home at 2542 Franklin Avenue, in a working-class neighborhood. Her parents, like many families in early 20th century America, were hardworking and traditional. Her father, William Mohrman, was a former baker who had transitioned into life as a clerk, a quiet man with a reputation for honesty and modesty. Her mother, Margaret, stayed home to care for Mary and her siblings, ensuring that the household ran with warmth and structure. The Mohrmans were a close-knit family, and although they didn't have much in the way of wealth, they valued education, faith, and respectability. Mary was the youngest in the household, and that often meant she was doted on, but not spoiled. Her siblings saw her as gentle, thoughtful, and surprisingly independent for her age. She could tie her own shoes. She made her own bed. She loved helping her mother in the kitchen, especially when baking was involved. Stories passed down from family acquaintances said Mary had a particular fondness for sweetbread and jam, which she always asked for at breakfast. And like many children of the time, she found joy in the small rituals of daily life, feeding the neighborhood cats, skipping rope in the alley behind her home, or carefully carrying letters to neighbors for her mother. She was quiet, but not shy, reserved, but not fearful. People who remembered her said she spoke with intention, not with hesitation. At her Catholic school, Mary was regarded as very good by her teachers, punctual, respectful, and always attentive. She wasn't the type to speak out of turn or disrupt class. Instead, she sat near the front, her hands folded neatly on her desk, absorbing everything around her. It's that sense of order and routine that makes her disappearance feel even more jarring. There was no chaos in Mary's life, no secret rebellion, no dangerous friendships. She wasn't the kind of child to wander off or take unnecessary risks. She followed instructions carefully and was trusted by her parents to run short errands, something very normal for children at the time, especially in tightly knit neighborhoods where everyone knew each other by name. And this is where the haunting contrast begins to take shape. In the hours before her death, Mary was doing something entirely ordinary, delivering a small package for her mother to a neighbor. It was a task she had done before, with no hesitation. She knew the streets. She knew the people. And most of all, she had no reason to be afraid. Her route should have taken no more than 15 minutes. A simple there and back journey. But Mary never returned. To understand the weight of what happened to her, it's important to first understand who she was. Not a headline, not a court case, but a little girl. A child with favorite colors, quiet habits, and a life ahead of her filled with the kind of dreams only an 8-year-old can hold. Maybe she wanted to be a teacher, or a baker like her father used to be. Maybe she just wanted to grow up in St. Louis, marry someone kind, and have a home filled with the same warmth and safety her parents gave her. We'll never know, because all of those futures, those moments that should have unfolded naturally with time, were stolen from her. In cases like these, especially when they grow old and cold, it's easy to focus on theories, timelines, and speculation. But before we go there, we need to hold space for Mary, the person, not just the victim. A girl whose story was written in soft gestures and quiet mornings. A daughter who said goodbye to her mother that day, with no idea it would be for the last time. A sister who was likely expected home in time for dinner. That's the tragedy of Mary Mohrman's story. It didn't happen because she was reckless. It didn't happen because she lived in a dangerous place. It happened because evil exists, and sometimes it finds its way into the quietest corners of life, right when we least expect it. It was Tuesday, May 4th, 1909, when the quiet rhythm of Mary Mohrman's life came to a sudden, violent halt. The day had started out unremarkably. Warm sunlight filtered through the windows of the Mohrman home on Franklin Avenue, and the familiar scent of breakfast filled the air. For the Mohrmans, it was just another school day. And for Mary, who was only 8 years old, that meant slipping into her simple dress, brushing her hair neatly, and getting ready to learn. By all accounts, the morning passed uneventfully. Mary attended her classes at St. Liborius Catholic School, where she was a student in good standing. Her teachers remembered nothing unusual about her behavior that day. She was quiet, focused, respectful, just as she always was around 4 p.m. After school had let out and the children began drifting back into their neighborhoods, Mary was home again. Her mother, Mary Mohrman, had asked her to run a small errand, a routine favor. She was to deliver a small bundle to a neighbor, Mrs. Charles Bode, who lived nearby on North Market Street, just a few blocks away. It wasn't a long walk, and it was the kind of simple task that Mary had done dozens of times before. Streets that were familiar, faces that were known. Mary left the house around 4:15 p.m., carrying the package under her arm. She was wearing a dark blue dress with a white collar, black stockings, and a hat neatly secured over her blonde hair. Witnesses later recalled seeing her walking with purpose, alone, but not hurried. Nothing about her demeanor suggested fear or urgency. She was simply doing what her mother had asked. By 5 p.m., Margaret began to worry. Mary had not returned, and even with conversation or distractions along the way, she should have been back long before then. Something felt off. The minutes stretched thin, and by 6 p.m., Margaret sent out one of Mary's siblings to retrace her steps. By 7 p.m., neighbors were joining the search. Margaret's voice cracked as she called her daughter's name into alleys and down sidewalks. Doors were knocked on. Stores were checked. Church steps, yards, but there was no sign of Mary. It wasn't until the following morning, Wednesday, May 5, 1909, that the unthinkable was discovered. At around 8:30 a.m., a local man named Henry Schmidt, who worked as a traveling salesman, noticed something unusual in a vacant yard located at 2505 North 21st Street, not far from where Mary was last seen. There, nestled beneath a pile of old bricks and discarded wood, lay a small, lifeless body. Her arms weary at odd angles, her dress torn, her face bloody, bruised, and unrecognizable to those who had known her smiling just the day before. She had been strangled, authorities later concluded, possibly with a piece of cloth or her own undergarments. There were signs of sexual assault, though such details were only whispered about in the conservative press of the day. Her killer had not just ended her life, he had violated and discarded her like trash. Shock rippled through the city. This wasn't a crime of theft or drunken violence. This was something far darker. The murder of a child, an innocent girl, attacked in broad daylight and left in a public yard, was almost unheard of at the time. St. Louis, though growing, still saw itself as a place where families were safe and where children could roam freely. But that illusion shattered with the discovery of Mary's body. The police response was immediate. Detectives from the 4th District were called in. Crime scene preservation, of course, was rudimentary by modern standards. But officers attempted to map out her final movements. Statements were taken. Witnesses were questioned. Dozens of citizens came forward, offering bits and pieces of potential sightings. One boy claimed to have seen a man talking to Mary near a vacant lot around 4:30 p.m. A shopkeeper said he noticed a nervous-looking man walking quickly down the street shortly after, but their descriptions varied wildly. Some said the man had a mustache. Others said he was clean-shaven. Some said he wore a brown coat. Others a dark gray one. Nothing stuck. The more witnesses spoke, the more the picture blurred. There were other oddities, too. One report suggested that Mary had been followed for several blocks by an unknown man earlier in the week. Another neighbor later mentioned hearing a sharp scream that Tuesday afternoon, but dismissed it at the time as children playing. By May 6th, newspaper headlines screamed with horror. The St. Louis Republic described the crime as the vilest outrage ever committed in the city. Public fury escalated. Crowds gathered outside the Mohrman home. Strangers wept. Mothers clutched their children tighter. And under growing pressure, police promised justice would be swift. But behind the scenes, detectives struggled. The crime had occurred in a relatively open area. No weapon was found. No clear witness had seen the exact moment of the attack. The evidence was sparse, and time was slipping away. The day that Mary Mohrman vanished began like any other familiar streets. A simple task, the sunlight of a spring afternoon. But somewhere, in the narrow space between routine and horror, someone intercepted her life. Someone watched her walking alone. Someone made a decision, and within the span of an hour, a neighborhood lost its innocence, and a family was shattered beyond repair. When Mary Mohrman's body was discovered on the morning of May 5, 1909, the reaction from law enforcement was immediate, intense, and chaotic. The St. Louis Police Department, already under scrutiny for rising crime in working-class neighborhoods, was thrown into crisis. The brutal murder of an 8-year-old girl violated, strangled, and discarded in plain sight was the kind of case that could ignite panic. And it did. Detectives from the 4th District, one of the busiest and most under-resourced divisions at the time, were dispatched to the scene within minutes. According to historical reports, they cordoned off the vacant lot at 2505 North 21st Street, where Mary's body had been found. But crime scene protocols in 1909 were a far cry from what we understand today. There were no rubber gloves, no DNA swabs, no protective coverings. Curious onlookers crowded around the body. Reporters walked freely across the yard. And within hours, any hope of preserving physical evidence was gone. Still, police pressed forward. They noted the position of Mary's body, her clothing torn, her face swollen and bruised, and her arms thrown outward as if she had struggled fiercely. A post-mortem examination, performed in rudimentary fashion, confirmed strangulation as the cause of death. The coroner also found indications of sexual assault, though those details were buried beneath vague language in newspaper coverage. Likely to spare the sensitivities of a conservative public, the officers began canvassing the neighborhood immediately. Nearly every household within several blocks was visited. Residents were asked if they had seen anything unusual, anyone loitering, any strange noises, any unfamiliar faces. Some said they'd noticed a man hanging around the area over the past few days. Others mentioned seeing Mary walk by alone, but didn't see her again afterward. One neighbor recalled hearing a girl scream around 4:30 p.m. on the day of her disappearance, but thought it was children playing. Then came the interviews, which were frantic and inconsistent. Dozens of witnesses gave statements, and many contradicted each other. Several described seeing Mary speaking to a man in a dark coat with a slouched hat, but others swore they saw her walking alone. A few claimed to have seen a man running down a nearby alley shortly after 5 p.m., but their descriptions varied in height, clothing, and complexion. The more the police asked, the more the story fractured, and soon a suspect emerged, not through evidence, but through public pressure. That suspect was Willie Mueller, a local 19-year-old with a troubled history. Mueller was known to police for petty crimes, mostly theft, and lived not far from the crime scene. What made him stand out, according to police, was a set of bruises and scratches on his hands and arms, which they claimed could have come from a struggle. Mueller was brought in for questioning and reportedly confessed, though under suspicious circumstances. According to one reporter, Mueller spoke confusedly, and his statement lacked key details that would only be known to the actual killer. Despite this, police doubled down. With the public demanding swift justice, Mueller was arrested and charged with Mary's murder just 2 days after her body was found. The press ran wild. Headlines labeled him a monster. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch published speculative accounts of his behavior and character, painting him as unstable, volatile, and capable of horrific violence. But behind the scenes, doubts began to surface. First, there was no physical evidence linking Mueller to the crime. No fingerprints, though, to be fair, Fingerprinting was still a primitive science in 1909. No weapon. No clothing fibers. Nothing to definitively tie him to the scene. Second, his confession was murky. Some reports suggest he was interrogated for over 12 hours without legal representation, a practice common at the time. One officer admitted that Mueller seemed confused, even afraid, and might have been coerced into admitting guilt. Others in the department were less convinced, noting the inconsistencies in his story. And then came the trial rushed. Public affair filled with emotion, but little substance. Mueller's defense attorney, clearly overwhelmed, pointed out the complete lack of forensic evidence. He questioned the reliability of witness statements, many of which had changed multiple times. And he argued that Mueller had an alibi. At the time of the murder, he was supposedly working at a nearby factory. Several co-workers backed this claim. Despite the shaky case, the jury deliberated for just 3 hours. Mueller was acquitted not because the public had softened, but because the prosecution's case had collapsed under its own weight. The city had wanted justice, but the system had delivered only confusion. After the trial, public trust in the investigation eroded. Citizens questioned whether the right person had even been arrested. Rumors began to circulate about another man, an older individual known to loiter near schools, who had once been questioned in connection with a separate assault on a child. But no charges were ever filed. He disappeared from the narrative as quickly as he'd entered it. The media frenzy that had initially fueled the investigation began to wane. Other headlines took over. And just weeks after Mary's murder had shocked the city, it seemed St. Louis was moving on. The police never named another serious suspect. The case file grew cold. Evidence poorly preserved from the start was eventually lost or discarded. Witnesses moved away. And with each passing year, Mary's name slipped further into obscurity. There were a few bizarre developments in the years that followed. In 1912, a man incarcerated in another state claimed responsibility for Mary's murder, but his story fell apart under scrutiny. In the 1930s, a retired detective reportedly told a journalist that everyone knew who had done it, but the city wasn't ready for the truth. That comment, cryptic and chilling, has never been explained, and so the investigation stalled, not because of a lack of interest, but because of a lack of clarity. The truth was buried beneath media pressure, poor policing, and a rush to calm public outrage. And Mary Mohrman, the little girl who had simply been running an errand for her mother, was left with no voice to tell her side of the story. This is where the heart of the mystery lies. Not in what we know, but in what was overlooked, ignored, or erased. The Mary Mohrman case wasn't just a murder. It was a failure of the justice system, of law enforcement, and of a city desperate to forget what it could never truly explain. In the days following Mary Mohrman's murder, as the shock gripped the city of St. Louis, the police and the public quickly rallied around what seemed to be the most plausible theory. And that theory pointed squarely at one man. Willie Mueller. To many, Mueller fit the role of the perfect suspect. He was 19 years old, a local delinquent known for petty thefts and loitering in the area where Mary disappeared. He didn't have a stable job, had reportedly fallen in with the wrong crowd, and perhaps most damning of all, he had a prior reputation with local law enforcement. In 1909, that was often all it took to earn suspicion. When police found scratches and bruises on his arms during questioning, they claimed it could have come from Mary struggling during the assault. Mueller, under pressure and possibly exhausted from hours of interrogation, allegedly confessed to the murder, though the exact wording of that confession was never made public in full. Newspapers reported that he admitted guilt in a confused and halting manner. And just like that, the story locked into place for many. He had motive. He had means. He had opportunity. But when you look closer, something doesn't quite add up. The supposed motive for Mueller was never clearly explained. Some believed it may have been a crime of impulse, a violent outburst triggered by sexual frustration or mental instability. Others claimed he may have been under the influence of alcohol or other substances. But there was no consistent psychological evaluation presented in court, no history of violence toward children, and no reports of prior deviant behavior. The timeline also raised concerns. Multiple co-workers from a nearby factory testified that Mueller had been at work during the window of Mary's disappearance. These statements, though seemingly credible, were brushed aside by authorities who insisted that Mueller could have slipped away unnoticed. But again, no physical evidence placed him at the scene. And that brings us to one of the biggest problems with the case against him. There was nothing concrete. No fingerprints. No clothing fibers. No eyewitness who saw him with Mary. Only circumstantial details, his general location, a vague confession, and injuries that could just as easily have come from a fight or accident. Still, many in the public believed he was guilty. The press painted him as a troubled loner. The community, reeling from the horror of a child's murder, was desperate for closure. And for some, it was easier to believe that the killer had been caught than to accept that he might still be out there. But Mueller's trial fell apart almost as quickly as it began. Under questioning, his confession unraveled. Defense attorneys pointed out that he had been interrogated for over 12 hours without legal counsel, and may not have understood the gravity of what he was saying. Witnesses changed their statements. Prosecutors struggled to explain how Mueller could have transported Mary's body to the vacant lot without being seen. Ultimately, the jury was unconvinced. Mueller was acquitted. And after his release, the city seemed to collectively exhale. For many, it didn't matter that he walked free. He had still been blamed. The case, in their minds, was essentially over, but the reality is more complex. If Mueller wasn't the killer, then the most obvious theory, the one most people accepted in 1909, falls apart. And that's what continues to haunt this case more than a century later. Because if it wasn't him, then who was it? Was Mueller simply a scapegoat, chosen out of desperation by police under immense public pressure? Did his rough background and odd demeanor make him an easy target in a city desperate for a villain? Or did he know more than he ever let on? Even now, some believe Mueller may have been involved indirectly, perhaps having seen something or known someone who committed the crime. Others maintain he was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, caught up in a tragedy he had nothing to do with. What we do know is this: the case against Willie Mueller, though widely believed at the time, never truly held together. It was a story built more on fear and on fact, on the collective need to restore order, not to uncover truth. And that leaves us with one troubling thought. If the obvious answer wasn't the right one, what else was missed? When the obvious suspect failed to produce a conviction, the Mary Mohrman case was left adrift. But over the years, quiet whispers and subtle clues began to suggest a more unsettling possibility, that Mary's killer may have been someone hiding in plain sight. Not a vagrant, not a criminal from the shadows, but someone embedded in the very fabric of the neighborhood. It's hard not to wonder, could it have been someone the community trusted? One of the more persistent theories that has lingered just beneath the surface involves a local older man, known to several children in the neighborhood, who had been reported previously for odd behavior near schools. His name doesn't appear often in the press. In fact, it seems like the police never pursued him formally. But according to archived notes from a private investigator hired years later, this man had been seen frequently loitering near St. Laborious School, sometimes offering candy or asking children to help carry parcels. He had no children of his own, lived alone, was quiet, polite, even helpful in the neighborhood. But some parents, especially mothers, began warning their children not to talk to him, a strange figure who made them uneasy, though no crimes could be pinned to his name. If he did approach Mary that day, offering help or distraction, it's entirely possible she wouldn't have seen him as a threat. After all, she was taught to respect adults, to trust neighbors. This theory raises deeply uncomfortable questions. If true, it would suggest that Mary's death wasn't random, but predatory, calculated, committed by someone who had watched her routine, who knew her family's patterns, and who waited for just the right moment to act. It's not an easy idea to sit with, but it aligns with something the police themselves quietly considered in the early stages of the investigation, that the attack showed signs of planning. Mary was taken quickly, with no noise that drew attention. Her body was hidden under debris in a lot that wasn't completely isolated, but was just far enough out of sight. It felt deliberate, methodical. Another unsettling possibility centers around a rumored cover-up. Decades after the murder, a retired St. Louis detective reportedly told a local journalist that the department knew more than it ever told the public. He hinted at a suspect who came from a well-connected family, someone the press never named, and who was quietly protected from scrutiny. The story was never verified. No name was offered. But that passing comment has fueled speculation ever since. Was the truth buried to protect someone powerful? These theories may seem like fragments difficult to prove, easy to dismiss. But taken together, they point toward a chilling possibility that the true killer was known, or at least suspected, but deliberately shielded from justice. Could it be possible that, in their desperation to restore order, authorities looked away from uncomfortable truths? Could the arrest of Willie Mueller have been a distraction from someone else, someone more dangerous? We can't say for certain. The evidence, already fragile in 1909, has long since faded. Names were lost, files were destroyed, and witnesses grew old, then passed on. But the idea that Mary's killer was never a stranger, that they may have walked those streets for years afterward, blending into the very neighborhood they helped devastate, is a theory that continues to haunt those who study her case. And maybe, just maybe, that's why this crime has stayed buried for so long. Not because there were no answers, but because some answers were too terrifying to face. The murder of Mary Mohrman initially stirred a wave of urgency investigators combing alleyways, neighbors offering tips, newspapers printing fresh headlines each day. But as weeks turned into months, and months slipped into years, the search for Mary's killer quietly unraveled, leaving behind only questions, regret, and a haunting silence that still lingers more than a century later. By the summer of 1909, the case had lost momentum. With Willie Mueller acquitted, and no new suspects officially named, the police found themselves chasing shadows. What little evidence had been collected was either tainted, lost, or never properly cataloged. Witness testimonies conflicted with one another. Some names were whispered behind closed doors, but never pursued with any legal force. It was as though the investigation had run out of oxygen, suffocating under the weight of its own missteps. The public, once so emotionally engaged, began to lose hope. The newspapers that had printed front-page stories on Mary's murder gradually turned to other headlines. A few editorials criticized the police for rushing to judgment with Mueller. Others hinted carefully at broader failures within the department. But none pushed hard enough to revive the case. For the Mohrman family, the emotional toll was devastating. Mary's mother, Margaret, withdrew from the public eye, rarely speaking about the incident after the trial. Some accounts suggest she refused to walk near the street where Mary was found, even years later. Her father, William, kept working, kept quiet, and aged quickly. One neighbor said that after Mary's death, the Mohrman home seemed to dim, like the joy had been sucked from its walls. No official reopenings were ever documented. No fresh investigators assigned. But that didn't mean the story disappeared entirely. Over the decades, new whispers emerged from amateur sleuths, retired officers, even distant relatives. Some believed the case had been intentionally buried to protect a hidden name. Others thought Mary had stumbled across something she was never meant to see, something unrelated to her, but dangerous enough that she was silenced for it. The truth is, there were lingering clues, but no one ever connected them. The man seen loitering near the school days before her disappearance? Never interviewed formally. The scream heard by a neighbor around 4:30 p.m.? Not traced. The suggestion from a retired detective that everyone knew who did it, but couldn't say it aloud? Left to rot in an unpublished interview transcript. And then there were the anonymous letters in the 1920s. Over a decade after Mary's murder, 2 unsigned notes were sent to the St. Louis police, both referencing the Mohrman child. The first simply said, "The man you want was never arrested." The second was more cryptic. "He used to stand on the corner and wait." Both were dismissed as pranks. The notes were never traced to a sender, and no follow-up appears in public records. But for those who believe Mary's killer was someone from the community, a man who may have been known but protected, these letters remain chilling. The trail, by then, had long gone cold, without preserved evidence or living witnesses. Investigators today, if there were any, would be starting from ashes. No DNA, no reliable records, no physical case file confirmed to exist. And while some have speculated that newspaper archives, old family letters, or church records might hold overlooked details, there has never been a coordinated modern attempt to resurrect the case. So, what are we left with? A little girl, a quiet walk, a vacant yard, and a city that moved on. Mary Mohrman's murder is not just an unsolved crime. It's a portrait of how justice can dissolve when no one knows where to look. A case that once consumed headlines now lives only in fading articles, scattered family memories, and the occasional online discussion from true crime historians. It's difficult to say when the case officially went cold. Was it after Mueller's acquittal? After the second week with no new leads? Or was it the moment her body was found, and the investigation rushed to fit a narrative that never quite held? Whatever the moment, the effect was the same. Mary's story faded, reduced to whispers, half-truths, and eerie questions without answers. And perhaps the most haunting part of all is this: somewhere out there, someone knew exactly what happened that day in May 1909. They knew how Mary's routine walk turned into her final moments. They knew what she saw, what she said, how she cried, and why, ultimately, she didn't make it home. But that person, if ever alive to begin with, is long gone, and the truth they carried may have vanished with them. Thank you for spending this time with us as we quietly revisited the haunting case of Mary Mohrman. If you've heard of this forgotten story or have thoughts or theories you'd like to share, we'd be honored to read them in the comments. Sometimes even the smallest insights can keep these stories alive. If you found value in this exploration, we invite you to subscribe for more true crime stories, unsolved mysteries, and haunting cases that deserve to be remembered. We tell them softly, respectfully, and with care, because even after all this time, Mary's case and the many like hers still echo in the silence.